Okay. We will get going. So my name is Dan Bromberg. I'm the Director of Academic Programs for the Carsey School of Public Policy. I'm also an Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science. And we're joined today by Dr. Jess Carson, who's a research faculty member in the Carsey School of Public Policy. And we've asked Jess to join us today because of her vast experience in conducting applied research, disseminating applied research, and really communicating to a broad array of constituencies and readers and parties. So we thought this would be helpful for both folks interested in learning a bit more about communicating research, and also potential students interested in learning about our academic programs. So thank you, Jess. Really appreciate your time today and joining us. And I was wondering if you could just Sure, our pleasure. I'm wondering if you could just start off by telling us a bit about the research that you conduct, kind of a broad overview of the type of research you do.
Sure. So I am a sociologist by training, but I've been at Carsey for about 10 years. I'm housed in the Vulnerable Families Research Program there. So most of the work I do focuses on the kind of demographic, social, and community barriers that folks face to making ends meet. Oftentimes that's really low-income families and kind of policy issues around their ability to do well, economically speaking. I also generally have kind of a place-based lens in much of my research. So that really means thinking about how people's characteristics and their situations intersect with where they live. And that's often with a pulse on kind of rural places, but also in terms of New Hampshire or other specific states as well.
Cool, thank you.
Sure.
So I just had a quick update for the viewers right now. Just on the bottom of your screen, give you some navigation tips. I forgot to do this at the beginning. There's a chat box on the bottom, which you're welcome to throw a few comments in. There's also a Q&A box on the bottom. So if you have any questions, Jess will be taking some questions at the end of our conversation. We're also joined by Robin Husledge, who's going to be helping us out, kind of fielding those questions and dealing with the chat box. So you're welcome to use those. Like many webinars, the viewers right now, the audience, we're not going to be able to hear you speaking. So if you do have something to say, you're welcome to jump in through either of those two tools. So Jess, you said kind of a place-based lens and looking at vulnerable populations. Mm-hmm. So could you talk about, how you narrow down your research topics? Because obviously, both of those things can span any number of areas. So how do you get into, what topics you want to research?
Sure. So the answer to that is sort of, it depends. Sometimes it is kind of extending an ongoing line of inquiry, something I'm interested in over time, and I'm kind of updating or keeping track of. Other times it's a kind of emergent policy question that pops up, something timely or relevant, and I'll have the data at hand to be able to kind of address that and put some answers to the fore around that front. And other times it's working with partners who are maybe on the ground, often people who are working in nonprofit sectors or in philanthropic centers who really want to understand how to do their work better. And so some topics are driven by thinking about how I can put accessible, rigorous, good quality data in the hands of folks who are going to use it to then do their own good work on the ground. So it really depends a little bit how to select a topic.
So I'm wondering if you could think about examples from each of those categories.
Sure.
Yeah. So kind of continuing line of research that you've been working on for a while, something that might be more reactive, and then something that, might be done in partnership with someone else.
Sure. Yeah. So one of my kind of long ongoing strands of inquiry has been around thinking about access to childcare for working families. And so I've done a little bit of work recently around better understanding childcare supply in certain pockets of New Hampshire and how that matches up with childcare need. I just submitted a federal grant proposal last week that seeks to look at how those kinds of childcare offerings are shaped by the partnerships and the funding streams that are in place to help support their offerings. In terms of kind of rapid response stuff, a good example might be a data snapshot that I'm working on this week. Hopefully will come out in the next couple of days that is responsive to the COVID-19 pandemic. So there's some emerging evidence that suggests that rates and pace of infection is different in rural and urban areas, and in particular that there's some diversity within rural areas as well. And so I looked at rates of diagnosis in rural places and cut that by the shares of housing that is seasonal. So places that have a lot of seasonal housing, whether that's second homeowners or a lot of Airbnbs, places kind of attract folks into the region who are not from there, those places have really high infection rates compared to other kinds of rural places. So that was sort of a little bit more responsive to kind of the current context and seeking to add some data that folks could maybe treat in an actionable way and that will be useful to folks on the ground. And then in terms of kind of a longer term partnership, I last week released a brief on young adult parents and their use of the federal social safety net. So that was in partnership with the Annie E. Casey Foundation. We've been working over a couple of years and thinking about young adults as parents and these kind of two generation solutions to economic mobility, and found that young adult parents rely on the earned income tax credit at a really high rate, but that the earned income tax credit also really goes quite far in helping lift them out of poverty. So not only are they taking advantage of this credit, but it's also working really well for them. That was a kind of an example of a partnership question.
Cool. So I'm curious, where do you get your data from? Is it always from sources that are, widely available to the public, or are these things that you're gathering constantly? How does that work?
Yeah, so I try to let the question drive the data, although sometimes we're constrained by the fact that our dream data rarely exist. So I would say my most regular sources of data are indeed existing sources. They're things like the Census Bureau's American Community Survey. That's one of my most regularly used data sources. The Current Population Survey, which is Census Bureau and Bureau of Labor Statistics, as well as pockets of administrative data, either from individual states or particular programs. Those kinds of data are usually available either publicly or upon request. You can obtain them. And then other times, the data maybe don't exist to answer the questions that you have. So you have to kind of go out and collect them yourself. And so I've done some quantitative work that way, some survey development, and I've also done a lot of qualitative research. So I've done more than 100 interviews in the last few years and more than probably a dozen focus groups to really sit down and hear from folks who are living some of the questions that we have. And those kind of data lend a different kind of detail and nuance that a lot of survey data don't have. So that's one good reason to sort of collect your own data in some cases.
Anything really surprising in a handful of your last briefs that came up as far as findings go?
Yeah, I would say that the data snapshot that's coming out hopefully this week, that was pretty surprising to see how disparate really the rates of infection are among rural places. So the rural places that had those high shares of seasonal housing, the infection rates are more than twice what they are in other kinds of rural counties. So there's quite a stark difference. And I think is important information for folks to have as they're thinking about, how do we be welcoming, but also think about whether there are strategic moves that we can make as states or as municipalities to sort of ensure that our infrastructure isn't overloaded with visitors or people who are kind of coming into our communities, and to sort of balance those things. I think having some additional data might be helpful there.
Yeah, great. Super relevant. And obviously, we've heard the governor speak about that over the last couple of weeks. So looking forward to reading that. I'm curious about how you think about your audience. There's really a wide range of people that would read any of these briefs, some of the data snapshots. So do you think about audience when you're crafting these briefs? Do you think about how you're speaking to them possibly differently or in a similar way?
Always. I think one of the best things about being an applied researcher is that you really want people to be able to take the research that you're doing and use it. And if you're asking people to use work that's confusing or not accessible or too dense or too long or too jargony, that's going to be a major turnoff for people. So I always think about my audience, both who it is and how they're going to access it and how they're going to apply it as I'm writing.
So how does that affect how you're writing, I guess? I mean, how do you think of, I mean, so you're considering different audiences. How might that change the way that you're presenting information, as opposed to, say, putting it in an academic journal or something along those lines?
Yeah. So in an academic journal article, which I do some of those too, you can definitely be a lot more kind of jargony and technical and kind of specialty specific, because you know that your readers are most likely folks who are kind of steeped in the same issues as you, and you can use key phrases that are part of the lexicon for your field that maybe outside folks maybe don't have access to that kind of embedded knowledge the way that a specialty reader might. When I'm trying to communicate with a broader audience, and particularly a policy audience, I try to really strive for clarity and brevity, because I think a lot of folks who are accessing policy research tend to be folks who are maybe legislative staffers. And they really have a lot coming into their inbox. They have a lot on their plate. So I think it's really key to make things very clear, very kind of accessible and brief, and above all, to really kind of spell out why this is important for people. If they have to really dig through your findings and think, yeah, that's interesting, but what am I supposed to do with that? Then nobody's ever going to try to apply it or use it. You have to really be very clear and upfront with, this is why this matters, and here's what we found.
Great, thank you. So we are a school. We offer 3 different academic programs. We have a Master's of Public Policy, Master's of Community Development, and a Master's of Public Administration. And I think, each of our programs tries to cater to students that are engaged in policymaking in some way or another. It might be on the implementation side. It might be in crafting policy. And you have obviously spent some time in the classroom as well, right? You have your Ph.D. in sociology, so there was that time there. You'll also be teaching in the MPP program in the fall. So I'm curious if you could talk about, what classes, throughout your academic career kind of have helped you get to this place in your career. Were you able to do the type of research that you do?
Sure. Yeah, so obviously there's a whole slice of coursework that is, methodological coursework, where you learn the kind of tools for conducting research. You either learn about, say, statistics, and you understand, how to suss out relationships in the data, and how to have good practices around cleaning and maintaining your data sets, and how to select the right statistical choice and what to look for when you're looking for patterns in the data, and that sort of thing. So those kind of technical components are, of course, very useful. But I think coursework more broadly, and not just research methods coursework, is really helpful for understanding how to be a critical consumer of research, and that can really color your kind of research chops as well. If you can look at a study and be versed enough that you can say, well, wait a minute, did they account for the fact that this sample may be biased, or that these data were sourced in this very specific way, or really ask those kind of critical data questions. I think that can bridge beyond just a methods class, and you can learn that in a lot of different courses. And then, of course, course content really matters, right? So for me, that was a lot of my coursework around social and economic stratification, understanding access to resources and power, and how those things are differentially allocated in society. I think that's really important for informing the content of my work, as is understanding the processes of policy making and policy, forming policy questions. I think, that kind of content certainly shapes my research today as well. I think it would be much less useful body of work if I were writing without any understanding of how policies are actually crafted or implemented or delivered. I think you really need to also have that kind of lens on things too, in order to produce research that can actually be applied.
So it sounds like quite a mix of your course has really influenced where you're at. So you will be teaching statistics in the fall, an intro to statistics course in the Masters of Public Policy program.
Yep.
I'm curious how, any of this will kind of infuse that course and, how you think about crafting a course like that in relation to, the research that you do.
Yeah, I think my sort of applied researcher lens is going to very much color the way that I deliver this class, because it's hard for me to think about statistics as purely abstract at this point. They're the tool of my trade, and I think being able to not just tell students here is how the statistical test is performed, but really ground that in, and here's a case in which you would use it, and here's the type of question that you would answer, and here's an instance in which you would not opt for this kind of process and you would opt for another. I think that will be hopefully helpful to students to sort of engage with material in a very concrete and applied way. There's probably, there are some components of statistics that are a bit abstract, but I think by and large, it's going to be a pretty applied statistics class if I'm the one teaching.
Cool.
And there is a question, if you're open to answering a question right now. No?
Yeah, sure. Why not?
The question is, what are the differences between master's in community development and a master's in public administration?
Sure. So what I would say is I'll speak kind of broadly about all three of our degrees quickly, and then I'll come back to Jess with one more question about coursework. So the three degrees really are all what we would consider public service degrees. The Masters of Community Development, I would say, happens more at the grassroots level, more at the project and program management level. So how do you get a project off the ground? How do you work with community members to bring that project through to fruition? And, how do you move something like that along in a very inclusive manner? The Masters of Public Administration, I would say, looks at problems much more from an organizational lens. So how do you manage an organization that might have, a dozen to 24 different programs going on and hundreds of different projects going on. So it's more of a macro lens as opposed to a more project-based or micro-based lens. The skill sets, I would say, are pretty transferable. It's just simply the way that we're talking about the problem frequently. But many of the tools and many of our courses, frankly, are cross-listed, and our students jump back and forth between those programs. So they're slightly different, right, in kind of the lens that they're using. But hopefully you walk out with a solid foundation of tools and skills that you'd be able to apply across the board. And I'm happy to, kind of keep talking about those after a few more questions with Jess. I think, the methods course, as you mentioned, is, certainly an area that we could see how research, right, is relevant. But our students do take this wide range of courses. So I'm just curious how you would communicate to a student, considering our programs, what's important for them to soak in thinking about, working in applied research field and conveying research to a broad range of audiences. What do you think would be important for them to pay attention to, I guess, during their graduate studies?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think, any chances that folks have to exercise their writing skills with a kind of laser focus on tightening and, never use 10 words if you can use 3, never use 3 if you can use 1, and really kind of sharpening up those skills, being able to put forth really specific arguments about, here's why this work that I'm doing matters in a way that, you can communicate that in a sentence. And if you can't, then rethink whether it really does matter. I think it's helpful to kind of sharpen those sorts of writing skills more broadly, whether they're kind of technical or not necessarily research focused. I think also kind of growing and broadening their networks, I think, is a really good way that coursework, even outside the methodological area, but sort of in other intersecting spaces with folks in other programs or folks with different backgrounds. I think, your time in graduate school and particularly at Carsey, I think positions you to be connected with a group of really smart colleagues and a group of really great faculty and staff. And I think those kinds of connections are really useful for helping to kind of shape and hone people's their own work and their own understanding, drawing on those colleagues for feedback or for help kind of fleshing out ideas or for sharpening up, kind of a policy focus or a framing of a certain question. I think all of those pieces intersect really nicely with the offerings that Carsey has and the way that we've kind of built our programs.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. Just thinking about the range of professionals that Carsey has, on its staff, from someone like Jess, who's doing, this applied research on a daily basis, to someone like our director, Michael Ettlinger, who has worked at extremely high levels in the political process, to Ken Johnson, who is world-renowned demographer. And there's just an array of people that all bring a different range of experience and expertise. Michael Swack, obviously, in community development finance work. So they're really just there's kind of this broad offering that I love that our students, have access to. And one of the things I learned as a doctoral student was kind of the more you're around, the more access you have to those people. And one of the cool things and something that we try to do, so we have a student lounge that's right in, our office suite. And we encourage students to really engage with these different faculty members. And I find the ones that do end up having a more enriching experience during their time with us.
And with each other, Dan. Let's not discount, how smart the students are and the diversity of backgrounds and experience they have amongst themselves. So I think, like you said, kind of taking those opportunities to put in the time and with face-to-face time or, staying connected with each other, that really provides a very solid kind of working base from which you can kind of grow your networks. And I am sure that folks, I know I still draw on my graduate school cohort and my colleagues that my friends that I made during that time are still folks that I turn to for puzzling through a methods problem or, a fresh pair of eyes to read on a paper or a proposal. So I think that's a really important element of it too.
Yeah, it's a great point. We just had a phone call, a few days ago where the faculty, all of our faculty members were chatting about, how do we continue to encourage our students to work together, dealing with our current situation where everyone is kind of virtual and not able to sit in that student lounge. How do we create that space and encourage those students to continue working on problem sets, to continue working, across groups? So yeah, it's a really excellent point. I think there's so much learning that happens, through your peer groups and your colleagues. Well, thank you, Jess.
My pleasure. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, really appreciate your time. I think there's a lot of insight that, is super helpful for our students, our potential students. And Robin, I don't know if there are any other questions hanging on out there that we're not seeing, but we're happy to take some questions now if folks have anything that they want to ask.
And in the meantime, Dan, I just want to add that I am always delighted to hear from students or potential students. So if anybody has questions about anything we've talked about or, ideas or thoughts, I'm always happy to connect with folks and would look forward to hearing from anyone.
Dan, there's no more questions. I have posted in the chat box different web links to visit our different websites for academic programs, for research, and for publications for those that want to learn more.
Yeah, and I would just share Jess's sentiment. You're welcome to reach out to us. You have any interest about, our programs or any of the research that any of us do, we're thrilled to connect and chat with you whenever you have, any questions. So please feel free to do that. All right. Well, thank you all very much. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.